Speaking of Squarepusher, so I discovered Squarepusher's music after he'd been really around for quite a while. Discovered him around about 1998, just before the release of Music as Rotted One Note. I was just blown away by his music. He was the first person, I think, that really kind of got me moving and interested, from being interested in purely rock and jazz into electronic music, because he was so good at sort of manipulating the genres and mixing electronic music and some quite frantic and beautiful electronic music and live bass performance, and really turning the drums and the drum patterns that he created and dissected using his various pieces of equipment into something really quite lyrical and beautiful, as well as sometimes obviously quite terrifying. His music can be quite abrasive, but so I decided, having had kind of a love affair with his music for quite a long time now, that I'd try and track him down and see if he was interested in talking to us here at Radioactive, and thankfully he was. So I'm going to play now the first half of my interview with Tom Jenkinson, aka Squarepusher. Enjoy. A true musical innovator and explorer on the sonic fringes where jazz, prog, techno and electroacoustic music intersect, it's with genuine pleasure that I welcome to the show bass player, multi-instrumentalist and electronic music producer Tom Jenkinson. How are you, Tom?
Good, thanks.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for coming onto the show. What was it that initially made you fall in love with music?
Well, that's quite an opener.
I know.
Crikey. Yeah, that's a big question, but here's a relatively small answer, hopefully. I think it would be fair to say that music is unique, in my experience, in being able to produce and act as a stimulus for a wide range of emotional experiences.
Sure, yeah.
So, obviously there can be any number of events in a person's life which may produce feelings of sorrow or happiness and anxiety, whatever it might be. But music, in terms of the arts, is quite singular for me in being able to produce those feelings, those kinds of feelings, but without the typical real-world stimulus,
sure,
if you like.
Yeah.
It's, in some way, a way of accessing these feelings in a kind of realm of abstraction.
Sure, yeah.
And I think having somewhat scientific disposition, amongst other things, but I find that fascinating from a point of view of being interested in the way human beings work. I mean, how is it that, for example, a construction in music, which you could quite effectively and sensibly reduce to mathematical terms, how is it that when translated to sound waves can produce feelings in a man or a woman or anyone? Goodness knows it may produce feelings in animals as well, but it's this relation between the world of descriptive, mathematical, numerical, statistical terms and the world of the emotions, this link between them fascinates me. It always has done, I suppose always will.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, it's incredible. You're dead right. I think you hit the nail on the head with the kind of emotional thing that music can just bring it out of you, with the two notes following one after another is able to bring out such incredible emotion and have an incredible effect on your state of mind at a particular time. It's interesting that you said it can have an effect on animals as well. They're actually just after starting a radio station in Auckland here in New Zealand, specifically catered towards dogs. I haven't looked into it any further. I don't know whether it's sort of shows or just music. I'm hoping it's just music and it's not sort of chat shows. I can't imagine the dogs would be interested. But what was it that drew you towards playing the bass guitar then? Was there a particular person that you liked, or?
Bass interested me because it was the instrument that no one seemed to know what its purpose was. When I was like watching Top of the Pops, whatever music programs I was were available to me through the television when I was little. Because prior to watching such programs, I didn't really have a conception of what any of the instruments were, what they looked like, what their roles were. Prior to that, I approached music in the sense that it was all of a piece. It was all of a wall of sound that had no differentiation in terms of it being divisible down into elements which were in some way related to individual people's musical performances. It was for me, music was fascinating, as I was just saying, primarily on because of the emotional effect it had on me. And as I got older, that interest led me to try to find out how music was done.
Sure.
How music, this thing that called music, was actually achievable in the real world, and so instruments such as the guitar, had a quite an obvious role, I suppose, because it's one of the instruments in pop music, certainly, which is quite up front, which is quite noticeable, which is typically quite a feature. The bass was this instrument that was sort of mysterious, made this kind of odd rumbling sound in the background, and possibly correspondingly, the bass player was also not typically someone that was in the limelight, in the foreground of the musical performance. So I think for those reasons I was intrigued by it, and together with an interest in sounds coming from the lower registers. I'd love my sense of pitch and harmony. I think is particularly tuned to the area between the lower mid-range and the very low end of the bass register. It's where I want to hear melody.
Sure.
Which is not actually, I suppose, is not probably the most common approach to melody, to thinking about it as occurring in that register. But nonetheless, when you have activity and particularly leading musical motifs occurring in that register, I find it fascinating. So I suppose it's sort of a mixture of what I'm drawn to in terms of registers and sounds generally, but also a sense of intrigue about the kind of people associated, who are the people who do that sound.
Sure, yeah. You were saying your early influence came from, well, not early influence, but your first kind of vision of people playing the bass was obviously from TV shows like Top of the Pops, which would have been the same for myself as well. Because obviously there's definitely a distinctive kind of jazzy or fusiony style to the way that you actually play the bass. Was there what was it that sort of influenced you from a kind of jazzy perspective in your playing?
Good question. My curiosity with the instrument, fast forwarding a few years to when I was about 11, I suppose, when I first got a bass. First finally got my hands on one. I was, I suppose, using a fair mixture of approaches to it in order to try to advance my understanding and the instrument and technique and so on. One of them was just trying to copy what I heard on records.
Sure.
But another was just to muck around with it and just string together combinations of notes that I found interesting.
Sure.
And I was also trying to grapple with music theory at the same time.
Okay.
But so there was some elements which have lasted in my musical outlook from that quite traditional, shall we say, conception of musical theory, but probably the stronger force in all of this was the sense of let's see what this instrument can do.
Sure.
Let's see what happens if you don't play the combinations of notes that you hear on records.
Sure.
And there was a certain amount of music that was available to me as a kid, but let's remember that this was the early 80s.
Yeah.
The records that were available to me consisted of what I could pilfer out of my parents' record collection, little bits and pieces that I recorded from the radio, a few records that I got from jumble sales.
Sure.
But, the minuscule fraction of what's available to anybody now who cares to browse the internet and look for music. This is a microscopic fragment of the world of music. But to me, that was all I had, and that was, I suppose, the principal touchstone for what I was doing. But what I wanted to try to investigate was music where it's, there wasn't such a sense of restriction on the notes that you can use.
Sure.
Or these same patterns don't keep coming up. And as my understanding of it all developed, I was then identifying, it's like, okay, so then he's using this kind of scale, she's playing that scale, and I've heard all that before. So where is the music where you can just do what you want?
Yeah.
I've got some kind of, I think there's you could analyse, if you cared to, you could psychoanalyse my music as a resistance to authority.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
You could collapse it all into that if you wanted to. If you wanted to kind of summarise it, and there's some drive in me even back then was to try to discover the music where you just do what you want.
Yeah.
And you're not kind of stuck in a scale, and you're not stuck in a song, you know.
Yeah.
And so that led me to jazz, I suppose. That was probably the kind of most straightforward way of putting this. You know, I remember just asking people, it's like, what, you know, what is jazz?
Sure.
What is it? Is that music where you can do what you want?
It certainly does. It certainly does seem to be that. You know.
Well, I'm sure there's lots of people who would absolutely be horrified at that definition.
I think you might be right.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would run in horror from my, and of course I'm speaking, you know, in a partly, I'm kind of being slightly sort of humorous about the kind of, about my sort of introduction to this world. But, you know, there's a, you know, that was what I was trying to discover. It's like, where's the music where you can just play all the notes in between?
Yeah.
So that's what led me there, you know, just through conversations with people and saying, well, okay, so can I borrow that tape recording of that concert then? You know, I'd like to hear it. And it just went from there. So, okay, so you mentioned the sort of fusion-y angle. So I suppose, I think that's a reasonable statement.
Okay, good stuff.
And I think that, you know, that it was at a certain point, some of the protagonists of that music were an influence on me for sure.
Sure. A lot of people see it as kind of a bad word, I guess. Progressive rock
they do.
And jazz and fusion can certainly be seen. It's the last thing somebody wants people to say about their music. So I'm glad you took it at its face value. I don't know. I mean, look. I mean, I've got nothing. I've got no skeletons to hide. Everything's out there in my music, you know, and I'm absolutely, I suppose, you know, kind of shameless, really. I just don't. There's no. There are no sacred cows for me, and there are no. For me, purism is. I suppose it has its place, but it feels unhealthy to me. Sure.
It feels very much like a signpost to a dead end.
Sure.
And I'm concerned with trying to investigate what we can do with this thing called music. I want to investigate ways forward. I want to try to see what new ways in which notes can be combined.
Sure.
And that might take you any number of different places, but, you know, it's partly political to badmouth a genre.
Yeah.
And then there may well even be some sense in doing it, but from the perspective of a composer, you have to ask yourself if doing such things is actually compromising your vocabulary and shutting your ideas down, and ultimately whether if it's starting to limit your enthusiasm, because I think shoehorning yourself into this very, very militant, I listen to this and not to that, is kind of mimicking a lot of the very territorial, aggressive and frankly barbaric behaviour that you know, our societies and countries have treated each other over the centuries. I don't see it a good thing necessarily to divide up and decide which side the line that you sit on, and pour scorn on anyone who's not in the same camp. For me, it feels unhealthy.
Yeah, no, very much so. And it's interesting that you touched on the fact that you could, if somebody wanted to, they could reduce your music to a kind of a reaction against authority. And sometimes that reaction seems to be against your own authority, and that you sort of you're constantly, I don't like the term reinventing yourself, but you can definitely see the evidence of that, because you obviously were blending together these elements of the kind of quite frantic bass playing and what my wife likes to refer to as nosebleed techno together in some of your early recordings to make some quite beautiful things. I don't want to make it sound like nosebleed techno is a bad thing. It definitely isn't. And then you obviously took a kind of an about turn almost then in 2000 with the release of Music Is Rotted One Note. Was that kind of that sort of reaction for you, where you wanted to react against your own approach to music making? Yeah, I mean, there are I have to say there are a number of reasons. The principal one is that what I was doing with samplers and sequencers, and combining that with the electric bass, it started to feel like a straitjacket. Yes.
It started to feel like this is just. It started off as spontaneous activity, and it's turned into just a technique.
Yeah.
It turned into something that you could describe. You know, you could list it as almost as a procedure, like a way of approaching music that you could put in a textbook. And at that point, I just started to think I was wasting my time.
Yeah.
And it seemed very much like it was time to start again.
Sure.
Time to have a rethink. And it's I suppose to an extent a subjective matter as to how radical you consider that rethink to be.
Sure.
But to observe as well some of the external forces at play.
Yeah.
One thing I found particularly appalling is that people in discussions of my work, and not just in magazines and radio and so on, but actually to my face, fans would bring in the concept of my work in a conversation like it was a known quantity, like, oh yeah, this is what Squarepusher does.
Right.
This is how you describe it. So it's again, in the same way that the compositional and harmonic and rhythmic notions could be start to feel like they could be boiled down into descriptive terms. Similarly, the aesthetic and the response from the audience side had started to feel predictable and uniform.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, this is very much what the music industry wants people, musicians such as myself, to do, to
Sure.
behave themselves, to basically produce uniform, predictable consumer products.
Very much so.
Basically, so that they can be sold efficiently, so that they can be put out there in a marketplace, they can be described and pushed to potential consumers. And this is something in which I'm absolutely. I exist in tension with those forces.
Sure.
But there's the day will never come when I acquiesce to them, because, okay, I operate with that industry, but I try in my own ways to subvert its principles,
Sure.
to exist within it without being a predictable entity,
Sure.
without being a sort of a quantity, a known quantity, so to speak. So basically, to return to your point, basically the external forces were be they press, be they fans, whatever, had very much started to make me feel that there was a Squarepusher, an idea of Squarepusher was a very well formed, almost well behaved entity, and I think it's time to just throw all that out the window.
Yeah, well, you certainly did it very successfully with that record, and it's one of my favourites, I have to say, of your record. I thought it was pretty phenomenal. I myself, my friends sometimes refer to it as, and I hope you don't take offence at this, but as your bitch's brew to a certain extent. You kind of.
Oh no, I mean that's a very, in my view, it's a very. Yeah, that's a compliment and a half.
I'm very happy.
I've just talked about this let's call it a left turn, that happened at that point in my career. But still, you have to remember that my career is just a segment of my music making. And I got a record deal in 1995. So from then on, my musical activity, or at least some of it, has happened in the public sphere.
Yes.
However, there are sort of a number of years before that where I was recording at home, where I was writing music, and these kinds of left turns were just happening all the time anyway. I'd get,
Sure.
I suppose in some way there's also a childish element to it, where I just get bored of something and go, well, I don't want to do this anymore, and change and see how I can vary this activity of music making. So that's I suppose something which people will only ever really sort of it will only exist as a sort of a speculation for people in the audience, because this is stuff that happened before.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I wonder about the wisdom of releasing things that I made before, I had my record deal. I don't know. It's an open question.
Now, if you're just joining us and haven't heard the start of the show, earlier on I played the first half of my interview with Squarepusher, Tom Jenkinson, and for those of you who may not know him and who are just tuning in, he is a phenomenal bass player and electronic producer who sort of meshes all the styles of both jazz and electronic and techno. And we're going to hear the second half of my interview with him right now.
And so you went ahead and further obviously after another few albums, Selection 16 and Go Plastic and a few others after that, you ended up doing a solo bass tour, and I have to say I was very privileged to be at the South Bank for the show that you did with Evan Parker. Was that kind of the the pinnacle of kind of for you the total freedom of because obviously Evan Parker is to be honest, I have to admit I'd never come across his work before that show, and that show really introduced me to him, so thank you for that, because it was one of those life-changing moments seeing that show, especially the time when the set where you both played together, that sort of
yes,
it was like the essence of the freedom it seemed to be that you've been talking about.
Again, there are internal and external stimuli to do with that particular concert and those pieces. Over the years, it's I think fair to say that I've been fascinated with the usage and application of technology in music, and that can be, looking at technology with a very broad definition. So
Sure.
that technology could incorporate something as simple as a guitar amplifier or a tape recorder, or something as advanced as a particular application of DSP theory.
Sure.
It's basically a device or process put into the chain, which goes from my imagination to someone's reception of an aural manifestation of that. But yet, I began to be, again, this sense of predictability was beginning to emerge, where I thought I actually always up to my eyeballs in equipment.
Sure.
Whether it's synths, whether it's traditional live instruments like you would have heard a lot on Music Is One Note, where you have live drums and keyboards and guitars and so on, or whether it's synthesizers and computers and samplers. But no matter what, I've always had this kind of big cauldron full of steaming musical equipment in front of me,
Sure,
stirring it up and producing various kinds of results. And I thought, let's try to do something, even if it isn't musically or compositionally or harmonically minimal. Let's make it minimal in terms of the instrumentation. Let's just make music with one instrument.
Sure.
So that was part of the result of that, really. And it was also experimenting with little pieces of chord changes, melodies and so on, which really didn't feel like they fitted anywhere else, actually, that they felt too elaborate to exist with accompaniment.
Okay.
And nonetheless, another part of it was almost taking a much more, certainly not a musical look at it, but or so much as a one that's more to do with equipment, which is basically, can this instrument support solo music? Can the bass guitar be used in that fashion? Can it work? Can it operate effectively as a solo instrument? I mean, it's certainly a long way from the intentions of the people who designed it.
Very much so. Yeah.
So in some ways, it was an experiment to see if that principle could be subverted that far. Could it operate? And I don't mean just as a sort of this kind of sport kind of music where it's just someone playing as many notes as they can, playing something as complex as possible just for the sake of it.
Sure.
I mean something which may or may not be complex, but most importantly, that actually has a rewarding, compelling musical experience.
Yeah.
And that is beyond being validated just through statistical means, like you have in lots of guitar music, where it's this is good because it's really fast.
Yes.
This is good because it's really complicated. The complexity or the speed is neither here nor there if there's no resulting response in the domain of the emotions.
Yeah, and obviously you went from there's a few albums in between, but obviously you went from this, which was kind of the absence of technology apart from the bass itself, to the new EP which you've released this week, Music for Robots, which is possibly completely, if there is a scale, this would be at the other end of it from that perspective. Could you tell us a bit about the new EP? Yeah,
of course. Yeah, well, the basis of it is a robot that plays two guitars at the same time, another robot that plays drums, and another one again that plays keyboards.
Okay.
So it's this set of instruments with which we're all very familiar, I suppose, in the world of contemporary music, pop music and beyond. But nonetheless, these tonal palettes, if you like, are accessed through the hands of machines, through the hands of robots, through mechanical means. So for me, it opens up a new door on those instruments that that feel if they're not overused, then there's certainly so many different stereotypes and cliches and commonly made gestures with those instruments, and it's that kind of thing which I'm certainly not happy to try getting involved in repeating those gestures. I'm only really happy if I can try to at least subvert them, but better still if I can try to come up with something which gets away from them entirely. And as I say, the idea of being able to access the tonal palette of those instruments through a robot is an opportunity too good to miss, really. You know, I mean, I think one of the things which fascinates me is hearing that instrument that you're so familiar with, but being played by a robot. It gives voice to some of the aspects of the instrument that we've not really heard before.
Sure, yeah. I think it'd be interesting if we can get to the stage where maybe someone could create a robot that could actually play a solo out of nowhere that hasn't been pre-programmed. I'd love to see that day.
Well, that actually, I suppose, is probably, I mean, it's already, it's not without precedent, that kind of activity. You know, there's certainly the endeavours out there in the world, that to do with automating composition as much as they are to do with automating performance. But still, the problem, I suppose, is that when you automate the process of composition, i.e. you write a program to write music, still there's a human hand behind it somewhere. And the way that you write the program to write music will obviously dictate the way in which it writes music. So the problem, I suppose, is that the spontaneity and the originality and the creativity always stem back from the mind of the programmer to put it all together. So I suppose it's an open question as to whether that hurdle will ever be surmounted. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're one of the reasons that you were interested in this project was the idea of the kind of cliches surrounding instruments, because I think that baggage that everybody feels is with a lot of the instruments we sort of see in the common day-to-day in the Western world has led a lot of people to try desperately to find any instrument they can to add into their music and I sorry, by that I don't mean that the musicians are desperate, but I think they're just trying to cling to something that doesn't have that baggage to free them from those shackles.
Of course, yeah. I mean, on the other hand, I do find it as appealing to try to take an old instrument and breathe new life into it. I mean, I think it could be said in the case of, for example, the organ, that the work that Messine was doing with the organ in his compositions for organ was they feel very radical to me, and they're made on an instrument which has a heritage hundreds of years old. And an instrument as well which is drowning in stereotypes, drowning in associations, and some of them, some of them not so great. Some of them that I'd certainly like to, avoid myself in my own work. So it's, I think that kind of approach is very admirable. I see that almost as the bigger challenge, really, rather than inventing a new instrument, is to try to invent. Because basically it comes back down to the principle which I was forced to adhere to as a kid, which is basically do the best with what you can, because the means that I had access to were very limited. So it wasn't a question of sitting there going, well, I want to have this new instrument, because I didn't have any money. I didn't have any way of going and getting those things. It was a case of, well, if I want to try to explore ideas, if I want to try and express these things, I've got to use the things that are in front of me, no matter what they are. And I think my sympathies will remain in that direction, because I think it seems to me a function of privilege to be able to specify in advance your instrumentation, to specify everything that you want to facilitate your compositional endeavours. There's something I find more endearing about the process of, and ultimately, more appealing about the process of making do with what you find around you.
Very much so. Do you have any plans to tour? I'm sure you do with the new EP, and if you do, is there any chance we might see you in Wellington anytime soon?
It's a nice thought. Unfortunately, it's almost certainly not going to happen, because the costs of moving these robots around, apart from anything else, is they're prohibitive, to say the least. It's a bit of a shame, really. Well, it's interesting thinking about the theme of robots brings all manner of different things to mind, but one of them is how human activity and activities which we consider to be sovereign human territory are actually encroached on by automated devices. Obviously manufacturing has long been haunted by this process of people losing work and losing their livelihoods to robotic machinery.
Sure.
And to some extent, it's reasonable to find that the process of automation and robotics quite disturbing, because it ties into this drive to efficiency, which is a cornerstone of capitalism, which cares little for its workers' livelihoods. It's
Sure.
basically about making things happen as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
And robots bring that to mind, and in the world of music, it's a peculiar place for them to crop up. But I do think that amongst people, probably musicians have got slightly less to fear, just because there's a sort of premium, I think, on what human hands can do, even if it's complete with all of the mistakes and frailty that come with it.
Sure. Just one more question for you before I let you go, and that's I often ask people in interviews for the benefit of potentially any young people or I guess old people listening who are looking to start to get into making music and who are interested in making music. Would you have anyone who's any advice for people who are kind of wanting to get into making some sort of crazy mishmash of live instrumentation and electronic music, and what they should do to kind of start their way?
Crikey, yeah. I mean, it's a responsibility of sorts to give advice, I suppose.
Sorry for laying that responsibility on you now. So.
No, I mean, I'd just like to say something valuable, but after doing interviews for the last 8 hours, I'm not sure anything I'm saying is of any value.
Feel free just to say no, you don't have any advice,
Well, look, I mean, I'd just say, I suppose related to what I was saying a moment ago, I'd just say, look, don't obsess about trying to get the right equipment, trying to get the right gear, trying to get the right software, trying to get the right sound.
Yeah.
Get something, but then learn it inside out, because that's the key thing. Fluency is what you need to basically translate things from your imagination into a real world activity. If you haven't got fluency, I think you're kind of a bit high and dry. And especially if you're trying to mix up the activities of playing live instruments with electronics, it's a lot to put on your plate.
Yeah.
So at the very least, with those instruments, you need to be able to play them effortlessly.
Sure.
So it's hard work, basically. You need to absolutely work to attain that kind of fluency that you need, so that when you're fussing over your drum machine and trying to work out why the sampler's not working,
sure,
you're not going to then, even if that's basically ruined your concentration, you find it not so difficult to get back into the swing of playing again after all of that.
Yeah.
If you're self-producing in this manner, you're basically multitasking. I don't like that phrase.
No,
you're trying to accommodate all these different mentalities. You've got this one sort of quasi-scientific mentality of the engineering process and looking after all the electronics, but then you've got this, shall we say, a more creative outlook, which is associated with certainly improvising and to an extent performing on traditional instruments.
Sure.
And then the composer, obviously, who's trying to keep some semblance of order amongst all these different activities. It's a lot to do, and I think that it becomes more difficult still if you don't have a high degree of fluency in the way that the way that you're using the instruments, and that's not just playing; it's also the gear itself, the samplers and the computers. So basically, just learn the gear, learn it inside out.
Sure. Okay, well listen, Tom, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, especially after having such a busy day of interviews, and hopefully you can go and relax and start enjoying your weekend now.
Yeah, okay, that's not a problem at all. Thank you very much.